All right, so now we're back in GTO Plus for example 1 again, and we've got our game details, we've got our ranges. Now it's actually time to build out the sizings and start building this game tree out a little bit more. So let's click Build Tree, and we're going to get over into this Build Decision Tree portion. Now you might see this Basic tab. We're not going to deal with the Basic tab. We're going to go straight into the Advanced tab here. One core principle that I want to keep in mind during building bet sizes out, because I get this question all the time from really good players. I get the question of, well, how complex or detailed do I need to be in building out the sizes of my game tree? And I would say the answer always depends a little bit, but I would actually err on the side of simplicity over trying to add more and more sizes. And the reason being here is, one, I want to build a model that's going to actually give me some output that I actually could have a chance at executing in terms of a strategy standpoint. Meaning that if I build a model where there's 6 different bet sizes on the flop, there's no way I could possibly execute a 6 bet size model. Whereas if I have 1 bet size or possibly 2 bet sizes, there's a much greater likelihood that I'm going to be able to execute like that reasonably well. But 2, I also want to make sure I'm accounting for that trade-off of simplicity versus complexity and how fast the solver will actually run, or the resources that are required for the solver to actually run. What you're going to see here, especially once you start getting into streets that are beyond the scope of what you're actually trying to study, the more bet sizes that you start entering, it's just going to add unnecessary complexity to the tree. It's not going to change the output that much, and I'll show a test of this in a different example, but it's going to ultimately add way more complexity, and you're not going to necessarily gain or see a huge benefit out of it. So again, I'm going to err towards staying simpler rather than more complicated. The main exception to that rule is on the particular street that you're trying to study. So if you are studying one particular street and you want to study the effect of multiple bet sizes, then in those cases there, I would say add more bet sizes on that particular street. But especially as you start getting further and further away from the point at which you're trying to study, it's not going to matter how many bet sizes that you actually put into place, in which case then the better alternative is just to pick 1 bet size or 2 bet sizes and go from there. So we're going to enter the bet sizes in, and using that exact point here, I'm not going to necessarily mess with my out of position player. We're studying the in position player here. And the question that we're trying to answer here is, here at the bottom of the screen, how should we be constructing a single bet strategy on this board? Well, let's start with default settings here. And I'm going to actually lower these default settings here to 66% pot. Mainly because I think that's what generally happens in-game. So I'm trying to model the in-game default bet. And usually in live games, the default bet tends to be in that half pot to 3/4 pot range. I'm going to kind of hedge and go in the middle and say 2/3 pot. I am going to include this option here with only 2 bets left, get the money in smoothly. As we've mentioned here in Module 2, all this is going to do is kind of smooth out the process of getting the money in when there is 2 bets left. It's not going to bet 66% of the pot on the turn and then only leave 10% of the pot on the river to get all those stacks in. It's going to kind of split those over 2 bets evenly. I'm not going to include anything about donking here. So we are going to let our opponent donk if the solver necessitates that. We're going to keep that option available. And then I'm also going to add in an all-in, and I'm going to do this if the push is less than 150% pot. And what I'm basically saying here is if we get to a scenario where the SPR is less than 1.5 to 1, so there's 150% pot size bet left, then we're going to add an all-in. We're not going to necessarily go all-in, but we're going to add an all-in bet here if that scenario exists. Now I'm going to use custom settings for the flop for both players. The only reason I'm using custom settings for the flop here for the out of position player here is mainly for the check raise scenario. And the reason I'm doing this here is that 66% pot is actually a little bit of a smaller check raise for an out of position. So I'm actually going to up this to 80% pot size check raise. But otherwise, I'm not going to touch the rest of these bets. So basically what this means is, since I didn't fill out anything here, the out of position player is the player that we're not studying here. So we're not looking at this from the out of position player's perspective. Every single bet in the game tree is going to be 2/3 pot from this player. I'll run a test here in a future video, but what you'll see here is that it doesn't matter. Whether I put more sizings or change the sizings a little bit, the EV changes are going to be very, very small, if anything at all. So I'm going to choose to err on the side of simplicity so that my trees run faster and I still get the same outputs out of that. But I am going to spend some time detailing out the in position player. Let's start with the flop. So in the flop scenario here, what are we going to do here if the out of position player has a bet? So this is a scenario if the out of position player bets and they're going to be betting 2/3 pot. So that means the out of position player here is going to be betting about 4 big blinds into this 6.5 big blind pot, or a little bit more than 4. Well, I'm going to put in here a raise of 3.5x. So basically, if an out of position player here bets about 4 big blinds, we're going to raise to 14 big blinds here. And I think that makes sense, and I think that would be about normal here in this spot. For scenarios where the out of position player is checking here, now we want to find the right bet strategy, right? So we're not working in the confines of our own bet strategy here. We want to find what the single bet strategy that we should be using here would be. Now, there are a few ways we can go about doing this, but the way I like to start by constructing this is I actually like to put in 2 bet sizes, a small bet size and a large bet size first, to take a look at the output and see what the solver prefers and how the solver constructs the ranges using both of those sizes. But I also then like to look at each size individually. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add 33% and 75%. And what that's going to do here is that's going to give us 2 bet sizes on the flop. It's going to give us a 33% pot and a 75% pot bet size on the flop. And you can kind of see in this example, this is what I actually brought over. I wrote this down already, is that iteration number 1, I'm going to look at this for 2 different bet sizes, the large of 75% pot and the small of 33% pot. And then at the iteration 2, I'm going to look at it only at the 75% pot level. Iteration 3 is only at the 33% pot level. So in this first kind of section here, we have 3 individual solves that we're going to be examining. I'll move this back. And so we have our flop scenarios, and I'm not going to actually fill out 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet, 6-bet percentages because we're not necessarily worried about studying those right now. And we're just going to sit on the default of any single time that we have not filled this out, it's just going to enter a 66% pot size bet. What I am going to do here is I am actually going to enter turn and river sizings. Now, the river sizings don't necessarily matter as much, but the turn sizings do. And the reason being here is that I actually would play multiple sizing strategies on turns and rivers, depending on the individual cards that come, depending on my range, depending on what I actually bet on the flop. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to give 3 sizings here, a small bet, a large bet, and an over bet sizing. And this is just going to account for all of the various scenarios that I could play on turns and rivers. Because there would be scenarios where I would block with a 40% sizing. There would be scenarios where I would bet larger, like 80% here, and that's kind of a little bit more polarized. And then there'd be scenarios where I would overbet and bet just a little over pot. And I'll put 125% for that. And I'm going to copy paste this for the river as well too, to give myself multiple options here. Again, not necessary to do here. You can default to 2 sizes if you want for each of these. You could just kind of go back to the 66%. I bet you if I ran these both at 66%, it's not going to change that much. But what you will see change is the individual hands that the solver puts into these different bet sizes. They may change somewhat because, especially now that I have 2 bet sizes here on the flop, because the solver is going to find lines that use some of these multiple bet sizes later on and then prefer one of these 2 sizes over another anyways. So again, not super important to add all of these 3 sizings in here, but I'm going to do so for my own perspective, not necessarily from the opponent's perspective here. So I've entered the bet sizings and I'm comfortable with this, and I think this is a good baseline to start with. And we're gonna wrap this video up and move over to example 2, where we'll enter the bet sizings for that. All right, so now we're back over in example 2, and we've entered our ranges, and now it's time to enter some bet sizings. So let's build our tree, and we have our starting pot and our effective stacks here, and we're going to start entering our bet sizes here. So much like the previous example, I'm actually going to enter the same top components here that I did in the previous example here. So I'm going to change my default bet size to 66% pot. I'm not going to remove this donk scenario, and then I'm going to change this add all in if the push is less than 150% pot. Now, we're looking at this from the perspective of the out of position player here too. So let's just look at the in position player first, because this is our opponent. And I tend to be a little bit simpler when I'm looking at this from my opponent's perspective. Now, our primary question here is, how should we be adjusting our big blind flop defense strategy against an opponent who continuation bets with 100% of range? What we typically see when that happens here is when our opponent bets for 100% of range, they bet for a third pot. So that's what we're going to include here. Is we're going to include a third pot sizing here. Let's say they bet 100% of range for 33% of the pot. We're also going to basically say, similar to the way the example that we gave, is if we end up giving a donk, our opponent is going to be raising about 3.5x. And that is all that I'm going to adjust for my opponent in this situation here. I'm not going to change any turn sizings. I'm not going to change any river sizings. What you'll see here is I'm actually going to build this tree out a few times, and I actually have a few iterations here to show you. So first, I'm going to show you this when we look at the outputs. I'm going to prove a few examples to you. One, I'm actually going to take rake out just to show you what this tree would look like without rake. So we're going to use whatever we build right here with the bet sizings. We're going to take the rake out and look at how removing the rake affects the output. But then I'm also going to actually include the rake like we have in this scenario here, but I'm going to add more turn and river sizings here. So I will add some multiple turn sizings and multiple river sizings as an iteration, just to show you how this does not make a huge difference in the output here. So we're going to keep this here as the only default bet here for the out of position player is 66% pot on turns and rivers. That's it. And my point here is that this is not going to affect the outputs that much, so we can still build strategies based off of this. What I might want to do here in this case here is, we're looking at this for our opponent betting 1/3 pot, and we're positing that if our opponent bets all of range, or they c-bet 100% of range, they're going to do so for a small sizing. We can run tests to see, well, what happens if our opponent bets all of range for a larger sizing, and how should we be responding against that particular action there too. So that might be a test that we actually decide to run in a later video. Well, let's go to our own bet sizing here, and what I'm going to look at here under our own bet sizings here is, first I'm going to do custom settings for our flop, and again, as we did before, I'm going to up this check raise to be about 80% pot. Again, this is going to be a little bit more accurate as to the size we might check raise to, even more so than check raising to this 66% here too. And I'm not going to actually touch any turns and rivers here too. In the other example, when I dig into kind of the additional turns and river sizings, I will add more turns and river sizings here. But again, the point I'm making here is that we're not studying the turn. We're not studying the river. As you kind of move further and further away from the point at which you're studying, all of those kind of actions kind of blend together anyways, and the EVs kind of tend to run close to what they would have otherwise. So the test that we're looking at here is we're trying to answer the specific question of how should we be adjusting our big blind flop defense strategy. Once we start getting to turns and rivers, we're starting to move beyond the scope of the particular question that we're trying to answer here. So we're going to keep this sizing simple, and it keeps our game tree rather small so that we can actually run this, and it's going to run relatively quickly. So let's build our game tree. And we can see that, again, we have a donk bet, but if we check and our opponent bets, we're going to be raising pretty large here. So if our opponent bets this 33% sizing, our raise is going to be up to just over 10 big blinds. So about 5x here in this spot. All right, so we've built out our bet sizings here. We've built out our game tree. Let's shift over in the next video to examples 3 and 4 in PioSolver and build out the bet sizing for that.